Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm doing a quick little session here in order to help you with revising specifically for the Edexcel Shakespeare paper. And the second question, this is the B question. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share my screen, inshallah. So here we go. So it's supposed to be like a 5-minute booster. That's the idea. I'm just doing starting up the slideshow. So the point here is really to help you have a quick guide of, how to approach the exam. And a lot of this you should already know, so it should be nothing new. But I'm going to be trying to be as pointed as possible. Obviously, I'm going to be focusing on the Tempest. And let's see where we go from there. So in terms of question B, what we would remind you is this is the question where you refer to the whole book. Okay, this is the question you refer to the whole book. What does that mean? You can quote from anywhere in the whole book. Also, you may paraphrase. If you can't quite remember the quote, just so you know, there's more value in quoting. You get higher marks in an overall sense. Do not refer. This is talking about. Do not refer to the extract in the A question. Okay, so you really, even though it's right next to you, and you're tempted to use some of the quotes because it will appear that these quotes, you could actually link it to the question they ask you for the B question. Obviously, that's on purpose. It does say from elsewhere in the text. If you look at your question for question B, it will in bold, it will say from elsewhere. This is an implication. Do not refer to the A question text in your answer. And finally, in the B question, you do need to mention context. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So, the first thing you should do when you look at the question is to brainstorm some items that you could discuss. And before we look into this idea of the brainstorm, remember the timing. You've got about 25 minutes on the B question. So how much can you write? Probably 2 major paragraphs. Okay. So that means you've actually got limited things to say. That would either be 2 major points that you're talking about, or 2 major points with 2 minor points. Okay, so 2 plus 2, that's 4. That's 4 main points. Now, what that would mean is you'd want to try to have quite a few quotes, probably between 3 to 6 quotes per paragraph. Okay, so worst case scenario, you want to have 3 quotes per paragraph. Best case scenario, you want to have about 6 quotes per paragraph. Okay, the general rule is more quotes, the better. Obviously, I'm assuming that what you're going to do once you're mentioning these quotes is you're going to explain them. So how is the approach? What's the approach you're supposed to take in the exam? Well, this is the question of how do we brainstorm. The first thing you would need to do is you would need to break down, I would suggest, your work, this 25-minute response, into 3 parts. Okay, break things down into 3s. So if the question was on control in the Tempest by Shakespeare, what areas of control, how is the topic of control discussed in the beginning and the middle and the end? You see how literally just broke down the, structurally speaking, the paragraph into 3 components. So that's how I would try to think this through. Now, it might be in your first paragraph, you're going to focus on the beginning and the middle, and in your second paragraph, focus on the end. Alternatively, if you have more things to say about the beginning, the first paragraph will focus on the beginning, and then the second paragraph will focus on the middle and the end. Now, it might be there'll be a third type of student where they'll say, oh, is it possible that I just try and aim to do 3 separate, maybe smaller paragraphs, one on the beginning, one on the middle, one on the end? And the answer is yes, so long as you're answering the question about control. Now, why should you break things down into 3? What they want to feel, this is the examiners, is they want to give a sense that you are able to talk about this theme of control in a comprehensive sense. So they want to get a feeling that you are covering a lot of range. But not only that, you do need to go into some detail. Okay? For example, imagine you're writing the whole essay, the mini essay, and for the B question, and you only talk about the beginning, and then you finish. Yeah, you'll get some marks, but would you get the high level marks, grade 7s, 8s, 9s? And the answer is probably no, because you've not been comprehensive. Okay? But imagine you are so comprehensive that you do cover beginning, middle, and the end, but you give no details. Like you skim the surface of the beginning and the middle and the end. Also, that's not going to give you a grade 7, 8, or a 9. It is too thin, too weak. So it implies that you are giving some depth, right? So in terms of the beginning, in terms of the topic of control in the Tempest, again, break things down into 3. So give 3 significant examples. So I would think that the first thing you would talk about is the main character, Crossroad, how he lost control because he used to be the Duke and the rightful Duke of Milan, but he lost control through his secret studies, and there's your quote there, secret studies, where he started dabbling in magic. So he gains control using this magic, which he calls his art. He ends up gaining control, but this is after he's lost control. So there's a bit of a contradiction here, or a paradox, whereby by studying this magic, he actually loses his dukedom and ends up being exiled. Actually, he was supposed to be put to death, and they ordered him. This is the conquerors from Naples, or you could say his brother Antonio, who usurps the position of Duke of Milan. Either way, the fact is that they kind of get rid of him. And to all intents and purposes, they believe him dead because he gets chucked into a boat with his daughter Miranda and sent off into the oceans, and there he well, we don't know where he goes as far as the others are concerned, but actually he ends up alive. And what you want to do is mention that once he's on the island, we discover in Act 1, Scene 2, when he's explaining his life story as such to Miranda, that we discover that obviously they were saved by fortune and end up on the island. At which point you want to talk about who does he control? Because it says here he gained control through his art. And the first creature you can mention is Ariel, his elemental spirit that he is using his magic to control. He calls Ariel my dainty Ariel, and he compliments Ariel many times. So try to give one of these quotes to why? This emphasizes that he looks favorably at his obedient slave. However, this obedient slave wants his liberty. He says, my liberty. There's your another quote. Easy quote to remember. You want to mention this, my liberty meaning my freedom, wants his freedom. This, you see the idea of control, and Ariel wants to be free of the control. So that Prospero ends up having to explain what a torment I did free thee from. So because Ariel actually was trapped by a previous witch who died, called Sycorax, who imprisoned him in a cloven pine. You see the quote there, cloven pine, in a pine tree. Why? Because he refused her grand hests. Which, what does that mean? He refused to do her almost villainous commands. So you see that? Sycorax is also commanding Ariel, so you could link that in, the idea of control. But Ariel was refusing the control because he's a good spirit. And Sycorax wanted, we don't know what exactly, but we want, it's clear that she must have wanted him to do something evil. He refused, and so he gets entrapped. That leads us to Prospero, who he reminds Ariel that he freed Ariel, but then he threatens Ariel. So this is again showing control. If thou more murmurest, I will rend an oak and peg thee in his knotty entrails. Okay, so that's probably a long quote. You could probably say, peg thee, or I will, if thou more murmurest. Either of those. Meaning, if you complain anymore, I will fix you, peg like with a nail and hammer, hammer you into the insides of the oak tree, obviously through magic, and you'll be stuck again. So this shows the tyrannical side of Prospero. How does Ariel respond? Quote, my noble master, what shall I do? So he clearly is concerned with the threat, and he becomes actually, he reverts back to being the obedient slave. So that's something you could mention again in the beginning. And then if you have the time, it's worthwhile trying to mention Caliban, who is Sycorax's son, left on the island, the only other person on the island. So he's not an elemental spirit. He is half human born. Now, Prospero, unlike calling Ariel positive phrases like my dainty Ariel, calls Caliban thou earth or poisonous slave. So it's very negative sounding, which already implies a different type of relationship, a negative one. He uses control of Prospero to get Caliban to do these mundane tasks. Quote, fetch us in fuel wood. I think it's fetch us in fuel, which is the wood and things that he needs to collect. Also, he says, I'll rack thee with old cramps. Similar to how he threatens Ariel, although you'll notice with Caliban, he threatens him a lot more. But that's because Caliban is so disagreeable, keeps cursing. I didn't put the curses of Caliban, but you could easily find them. It may be worth mentioning one or two of them. But the bit I did put from Caliban is, I must obey, his art is of such power, meaning I must obey Prospero because he's too powerful. His art, that's his magic, is of such power. That is the beginning. So where is the middle? What do we talk about in the middle? Here you have some wiggle room. It's all dependent on time. The first thing you could do is you could focus on Ferdinand and the fact that Prospero has a firm control of Ferdinand. Again, it's Acron scene 2, so it's quite early. So there's a question mark whether you want to mention Ferdinand. I think if you have a lot of time, it's worth doing. So you have a third character where you show Prospero having control. Other people might think that is not necessary. So there is option here. If you focus on Ferdinand, some ideas you could take in terms of quotes is, I must uneasy make this, Prospero is saying, I must make it difficult for Ferdinand. Otherwise, because one of his plans is to get Ferdinand to marry Miranda. You'd have to explain that. So he actually is testing Ferdinand. So what he then says, using his power of magic and control, he says, he warns Ferdinand, says, Ferdinand first, he says, I'll manacle thy neck and feet together. Why? Well, he makes the suggestion that Ferdinand is a spy on the land and he's trying to usurp or, quote, to win it from me, the land, that is. Now, Miranda, trying to defend Ferdinand, kind of gets in the way, and Prospero actually says to her that I will have to, quote, chide thee, if not hate thee. And so she kind of falls back. What does that imply? Again, he's controlling even his daughter, Miranda. There's more you can say about this, but I'm just trying to focus on Ferdinand here. Prospero even tells her not to, quote, speak not for him. And in terms of the punishment, Ferdinand, in a later scene, in Act 3, Scene 1, is seen carrying logs. Again, similar sort of mundane tasks. If you think about it, bearing in mind Prospero has magic, he could move the logs with his magic, presumably, but he gets Ferdinand to do these tasks. Doesn't explain why, and Ferdinand says he has to be patient, calls himself the patient log man. Easy quote to remember, kind of memorable. What does that conclude? What does that demonstrate? It shows us that Ferdinand can't help but have to obey, and he is actually busy moving these logs around. So that shows the firm control over Ferdinand by Prospero. However, the point that could be more important, I feel this is probably a bigger point in the middle section, is, and it will follow on neatly with talking about Caliban previously in the beginning, is how Caliban encounters Stefano, and this is a subplot. Stefano, the drunken butler, he actually believes Stefano could be a rival against Prospero. So he calls Stefano, quote, brave God. Why? Because he drinks the alcohol that Stefano is drunk with, and he calls this, quote, celestial liquor. Notice this heavenly drink that you have. Caliban is complimenting Stefano and believes that perhaps this magical liquid that Stefano is drinking is on an equal is on an equal footing with Prospero, and therefore sees Stefano as a potential rival. So he gets excited and starts singing a song, quote, has a new master, meaning Caliban has a new master. Later, he starts trying to persuade Stefano to try to eliminate the threat of Prospero. Some of the quotes is mentioned that he's saying Prospero, well, the quote here is saying subject to a tyrant, meaning he, Caliban, subject to a tyrant who cheated me of this island. Here, the idea of control, isn't it? That Prospero is in control. By sorcery, he got this isle. So he blames the power on the magic. So the control is through the magic. So you can link both magic and control with this quote. And his idea is, he gives actually a whole list of different ways of killing Prospero, but the good, easy one to remember is brain him, meaning to get a nail and hammer it into his skull when he's asleep. And he also reminds or warns Stefano, without them, that is his books, he is but a sot, meaning useless. So we can get rid of his control by getting rid of his magic. So he's giving him advice. Stefano actually agrees to the plan. He says, monster, I will kill this man. So Caliban's efforts at trying to persuade Stefano is successful. So here you can mention the point that Caliban manages actually to be in control indirectly of Stefano. So that's a kind of interesting side point to make. Prospero calls them the Confederates, okay? And that's a little note, that's a word you can use for Caliban and the other two, that's Stefano and Trincolo. Okay, so that's the middle point there. And possibly a last point you can mention from the middle is the banquet scene, whereby the main enemies that Prospero's after, which is specifically his brother Antonio the king of Naples, Alonso, and the king Alonso's brother, um, Sebastian. He calls them three men of sin. That's just a useful title for the three of them. But really, where you want to go is to mention how Ariel, in the shape of a harpy, confronts the three men of sin and says that he does this on behalf of destiny. So in a way, Prospero is being deified as almost taking on this god role, and calls himself a minister of fate. So thereby, Prospero again is being called fate. In this scene, Ariel makes a statement to say, "I have made you mad." So in a way, he's enacting the directive sent by Prospero to punish these three men of sin, and he's basically made them mad. So that's the enchantment affecting these three. Another word you might want to use is distracted, basically meaning mad. So it's a synonym in this case. And he explains why. You did supplant good Prospero. You did remove Prospero, and this is kind of a punishment against you, meted out by ministers of fate, and you will now suffer lingering perdition. Basically, you will be tortured, okay? Slow torture. So this shows, the reason why this is important is the control is demonstrating how Prospero is moving into a kind of ruthlessness. His tyranny is becoming quite profound. Alonso actually says that he's going to, in his distraction, in his madness, that he's going to run off and commit suicide. And he says he will lie in the, jump off into the water and lie drowned with his son, who he believed is drowned in the water. And the quote is, "With him there lie mudded." And in fact, all three of men of sin, Gonzalo mentions how all three are desperate, meaning they completely lost their senses. So that would be the middle section. What can we say about the ending? Well, in terms of the ending, you could break that into three. The first thing is to wrap up the undoing of Caliban's plot. And this is in the penultimate scene, Act 4, Scene 1, whereby Prospero uses the trumpery, which is the sort of second-hand, high-ranking clothes that he kind of puts on a wire, or rather gets Ariel to put up on a line, in order to trick Caliban's group, who, by the way, Prospero, talking about Caliban, says, "A born devil whose nature and nurture can never stick." But that's a side point, talking about how there's no good that can come of Caliban. But really, what you want to focus on is, "I will plague them all, even to roaring." This is a statement by Prospero saying that he will harm, he will plague. I mean, that's quite intensive. He will plague all of his enemies, even to go roaring mad. And he also makes a final statement, "At this hour lie at my mercy all mine enemies." So he has total control at this point. And that's kind of where you want to go. And then you want to move to the fact that when he has a conversation in Act 5, Scene 1 with Ariel, and he asks Ariel, "How are my enemies?" Ariel says, "Your charm, your magic, so strongly works on them that if you beheld them, your affection would become tender. You feel sorry for them. If you saw them, you'd actually feel sorry for them." So Ariel, ironically, who is a spirit, actually comes off as more humane than Prospero, who's supposed to be human. And I think you want to use those words, human and humane. Okay, humane has the moral sense. When Prospero says, "Are you sure?" you'd feel affectionate, and Ariel responds with, "Yes, mine would, my affections would, were I human." So Prospero reflects, gets him to reflect, and he says, "Well, maybe I should be kindlier moved than thou art. I should be more kinder than you, because you're, not human, and I am." So he concludes that yet with my nobler reason against my fury. I need to use my nobler reason against my fury. Reason versus emotions. You need to get rid of the emotions. And he kind of, there's a penny drop thing moment here, where he says, the rarer action is in virtue than in vengeance. That's a key quote. Try to put that in. What is rare is to be virtuous rather than being obsessed with revenge, which has been all consuming for Prospero on this island while he was hatching some kind of plan. And then he realizes that they being penitent, so long as they are repentant, my purpose doth extend not a frown further. I don't need, that's my purpose. He suddenly realizes through Ariel that it's not about revenge, it's actually about repentance and virtue. So this is an important point because this is what gets him to change. And then you end with the loss of control or the deliberately deciding to get rid of this actual evil power of magic that's kind of affected him and made him very sort of domineering. He put the quote to use is, "This rough magic I here abjure." This rough magic, notice the adjective, I'm getting rid of. I'll break my staff, he says. I'll drown my book. So these are very significant statements, easy to remember. I'll break my staff, I'll drown my book. About Ariel, he says, I shall miss thee, hinting at the fact that he is going to let Ariel free, and shows that there's a type of emotion in him with his rapport with his slave Ariel. My dukedom, since you have given me again, I will requite you with as good a thing. This is a statement to Alonso once he has made amends, because he actually forgives them all. He forgives them all, and he makes a grand appearance, and everyone's amazed. But he says, and Alonso actually says, "Forgive me, I will give you your dukedom back." So there is a resolution and a coming together. So in response, Prospero, using his control, even though he's letting go of the magic, but he still has some kind of control, he will give his son back to him, because in actual fact, Prospero did not, the Ferdinand was not killed in or drowned in the Tempest. And also he sets Caliban free, because he gives the instructions, set Caliban free. Caliban actually almost takes a lesson, learns the lesson from Prospero, realizing Stefano was a fool, and it was foolish for him to follow him. So he says, I'll be wise hereafter. So there's lots of sort of learning going on here. And finally, he has the imperative, be free. He says this to Ariel. So loads of quotes focusing on the idea of control. Some of these are very worth mentioning. So how would you plan this now? How would you plan this in your work? Well, in the beginning, you'd have Prospero. You talk about Prospero and his art, as we mentioned. You link it to control, then give the Ariel example, move to the Caliban example with all the quotes I've mentioned, move on to the middle. In the middle section, when you're talking about Prospero and his art, you can talk about control again, but focusing on Ferdinand. But I said this is optional. This you could leave and instead focus on Caliban's plan, his counter plan to contend with Prospero, and how he's trying to persuade Stefano to rival Prospero. And you could end with the banquet scene where Prospero finally has total control. All of his enemies are in his control. And then lead to the ending. And here you could end by talking about how Caliban's plan is undone with all the evidence we mentioned. But then the realization, Prospero realizing that virtue, being virtuous, is key. And then the conclusion is he will remove his magic. And then there's the overall redemption for actually all of them. So and then you talk sum up in terms of what that means in terms of control. Finally, remember we mentioned there's context. So how do you embed context into your B answer, and what do you talk about exactly? So For context, when you're talking about Shakespeare and his time, the first thing that could be talked about in terms of the idea of control is the Atlantic slave trade. I've kind of put a couple of bullet points and I followed a time sequence. Now, the time sequence, I find it interesting to have the time there. You don't necessarily have to, but I do believe put in a couple of dates. This sounds a lot more factual. So try to memorize at least, I would say, 2 dates. And by dates, I mean the year. So you've got the Atlantic slave trade, where the Europeans in history began to take African slaves and ship them to America. This actually started as early as 1441, and it went on into the 19th century until it was finally abolished. So that's the first entry. Second, you could mention the European colonization project actually started in 1492. That's when the Spanish conquered the Americas. That's when this whole idea of going to different nations and controlling them begins. A side point is the idea of the Witchcraft Act, which is a felony. This was in 1542. It's worth mentioning this as a side context point. It's not directly about control, so you have to be careful. I would just suggest mentioning it in passing, if you mention it at all, saying that witches and sorcery was being involved in this was a criminal act. You could mention Dr. John Dee. I would suggest Googling him, but he was on trial in 1555. He was a very knowledgeable person, had loads of books, had a huge library. He was an inspiration for Shakespeare in coming up with the idea of Crossroad. So he borrowed from the character of John Dee, who actually became, he was also accused of sorcery and witchcraft because of his learning. And so there was this trial in 1555, but he was not convicted. In fact, Queen Elizabeth recruited him as an advisor to her afterwards. So he was actually quite high ranking, and that links up with Prospero being high ranking Duke of Milan. Now, then you could also mention the time periods. Don't do a list. I'm just giving it here so you're aware that the Elizabethan period kind of ends in 1603. The Jacobean period. This is when King James I takes over the Stuart kings from 1603 into 1625. And Shakespeare, his period is in between the two. So his period ends actually 1616 within the Jacobean period. Now, King James wrote a book called Demonology in 1597. So that's in the Elizabethan period. All of the witchcraft points are side points. They're not the main thing to do with control. You can connect it to control. For example, John Dee was in a position of authority by helping Queen Elizabeth, as mentioned earlier. So you could link in the idea of control. And in terms of Shakespeare, King James favors him and his acting crew, and they actually get a official kind of approval to be known as the King's Men. That's what Shakespeare calls his men, to perform plays in front of the king and that court. Now, the Tempest itself was written in 1610 to 1611, bearing in mind that Shakespeare died 1616, so just 5 years later. Apparently, the Tempest was one of his last plays. So you want to connect the Tempest to the Jacobean period. And the last thing you could mention is the Pilgrim Fathers were people from the UK who felt that things were very difficult in the UK or in England, and they decided that they will sail to America and live a freer life. So this would kind of connect with the idea, again, slightly different theme, but the idea of utopia. Okay, so just a couple of dates. I think the dates are quite useful there. Another thing you could talk about is context about the play itself in terms of dramatic conventions. So just remember tragedy conventions, the idea of hamartia or tragic flaw. So every major hero or protagonist in the tragedies has some kind of tragic flaw. So the tragic flaw they say about Crossroad would be his magic, because it's the thing that is his undoing, and is the thing that gets him chucked out of his dukedom. Um, so that is clearly a weakness, and it's only until the end of the play that he realizes how the magic is a real problem, and you could argue is all consuming, and realizes making him inhumane. Also, a trend was this revenge tragedy at the time. It was a popular genre. The revenge tragedy, the idea somebody is wronged, and the main hero gets his revenge. And by the end, he gets his revenge, and usually at the end, loads of people die. So it's a bit of a bloodbath at the end of the play. This was a popular genre. The most famous one being the Spanish tragedy by Thomas Kidd. Why is that important? You want to mention that Shakespeare created a new genre. Remember, it's his last play, so he was actually trying to do something kind of unique. And this genre was the tragic comedy, combined both. This was a new genre, didn't exist before as such. And bearing in mind that this is Shakespeare's last play, connect the two and link it to the idea of redemption, whereby at the end of these popular revenge tragedies, everybody dies at the end. But Shakespeare, being Shakespeare, wanting to do something unique by creating this new genre, this idea, decided to flip it. So have everybody be forgiven at the end. So there was not bloodbath. So that would be his twist, in effect. Now, the last thing you could do is, we talked about the beginning, the middle, and the end, but how or in what way could you connect these context points that we mentioned? So one idea is this, mentioning the Jacobean period in brief, talking about John Dee, could be had at the beginning when you're talking about Crossroad and his art and the idea of control. You could also, when you talk about Ariel and Caliban, specifically Caliban, talk about colonization, get some facts and figures about that, mention the slave trade. That would be a good point to mention context there. It's not necessary to talk about context in the middle. It's good to talk about context at the beginning and the end. At the end, when you talk about realization that virtue is a key, would probably be also a good time where you mention how witchcraft was seen as a felony, and that King James wrote a book about demonology, not because he was interested in witchcraft, but not because he wanted to dabble in it. He was against it, and he wanted to. Wrote a book about how you can identify witches and sorcerers, these kinds of things. So this is worth mentioning that Shakespeare, wanting to target his audience who is the king, has the main character, the protagonist, being a witch or a wizard. He can't end with this person remaining a witch or a wizard, because then he will get the disapproval of the king. So he had to get a change of heart. So he disavows the magic, and so that is the link into the conclusion. And then the last part is mentioning the redemption being part of his spin on the idea of revenge tragedy, because he's creating a new genre. Okay, Jazakallah khairan. I think this is a good little overview. Hopefully, some of the quotes may be of benefit. I tried to pick easy ones. I'm sure you have others. I'll leave it there. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.